Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I am your host, Jim Jones, and I have my co-host, Mark Weaver, and our special music guest today is Veronica May.
Hello.
Thank you guys both for being here, and to our studio audience. And today we're going to do an introduction to Kinship Cafe. What is this all about? Why are we doing it? But before we do that, we're going to kick it off with some music from Veronica.
I know why the wind blows through the trees. It's a combination of all our good energy floating around. As I've been to heaven and back, yes I have. There's some healing and hurting inside this beautiful mind of mine. Inside this beautiful mind. I know why babies cry. I know why people die. 'Cause I've been to hell and back. Oh, I've been to hell and back. Yes, I have. There's some healing and hurting inside this terrifying mind of mine. Inside this terrifying terrifying, beautiful mind.
Thank you, Veronica. That was fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Loved it. Definitely helped set the tone for what we're trying to do here. And very heartfelt. And these are original songs?
Yes.
Yes. Beautiful.
Thank
Love
you.
it. So why are we doing Kinship Cafe? It really came out of, for me, I don't want to say exactly a crisis, but it was somewhat of a crisis where I needed to really get a better handle on what exactly is the meaning of life. I wasn't, facing any kind of impending doom or didn't have, somebody very close to me die, but for whatever reason, that was one of those things that was just really stuck with me quite a bit, especially as I focused on the idea of death. And, just thinking through, if at the end of our life we die and that's it, does that mean that it was all meaningless or for no point? And how do we deal with this? How do we come to terms with that? And so in my drive to understand, lots of study, one of the things that I come to find is that there's actually kind of two different ways that we can talk about meaning of life. And one of the ways that's probably most familiar to us, and this is where a lot of our self-help books are and things of that nature, tend to focus on what we might call the lower level of meaning, which has to do with what gives me pleasure. What gets me excited? What is helping me to be happy or feeling like I am doing something that matters to me? The trick with that, though, is that it ends up being very much focused around who I am and very much about subjectively what do I think is important, right? So there's this higher level of meaning that focuses on the question of, is there some kind of meaning to life that is outside of myself, that is beyond who I am, that's more maybe objective in that sense, that then gives some kind of context or meaning to life that is beyond what I would personally come up with. And it's very interesting to look at the literature as far as where people go with this question, because they really work hard to find a way to demonstrate that there is some type of objective meaning. And I think the reason they're working so hard at that is because we're really coming up against a brick wall from what we understand from science and the different things we know about physics and where we go even with philosophy, that trying to find that objective source of meaning isn't seeming to pop up, right? One of the things that has stepped in to really meet that need of how do we have objective meaning, even though there doesn't seem to be any just naturally occurring in the universe, is with religion. And I think it worked very well for a long time because, for the most part, people weren't that integrated for most of human history with people from other cultures. They mostly were focused with their own people who were of the same opinion of things. And so this construction of reality, this way of viewing meaning and purpose, wasn't really challenged until you started having people from multiple different faith backgrounds connect and start to interact like they do in modern cultures. And in that context, it suddenly becomes obvious there's some questions about that as an objective source of meaning. Because it's not just whether or not you believe in God. It's a question of, well, what God or gods? And how do you decide? Right? How do people, if you were to guess, what would you say for most people how they decide which faith that they tend to? For people who are...
I imagine some people would say it was what they were taught growing up, what they were exposed to. Or maybe others might have had a life experience that opened up a opportunity to have what they might describe as a mystical experience.
So we're back to something that's more subjective.
But Jim, I want to interrupt you for a minute.
Okay.
I am feeling absolutely catapulted into the stratospheric level of these big ideas that you are putting out on the table here in this context of the important issues around the meaning of life. Can we think of any bigger question to put on the table right off the bat in this initial, in the first episode of this video series that we have called a cafe? And you used the word connection earlier. And I guess what I wanted to share right now is how initially you and I connected was in a cafe setting and starting to have these kinds of conversations. And I guess I'm just going to come clean here about one of the aspects of why I'm here, and that is to ground this conversation into our being able to see how to apply. Why is it important to even consider the question of how do we discern the meaning of life and define reality? Jim is going off into the stratosphere of epistemology, of how we know what we know. And this is exactly where we need to start if we're going to indeed connect around having a conversation about important things in our lives, at an individual level, at a family level, in relationships, in our community, and dare I even have to say, nationally and in the world right now. What we want to do is to create a safe space to have a conversation about, learn about the nature of reality and the meaning of life. And our other byline for what we're here about is to develop life practices that can bring about greater well-being. And so with that, Jim, let's check back in to where you're launching us into understanding this question of how we know what we know.
Well, and part of the reason I brought up the question about how do people make their faith commitments is that part of the reason people reach for that religious option to have that objective truth that gives that meaning to life turns out to be subjective. because it comes back to a subjective experience or a feeling or something that's happened that led you to a particular way to believe that you can't necessarily demonstrate to anybody else. So we're back at it being a subjective choice. It didn't really fix the problem of something outside of ourselves, because it's still inside ourselves that we're kind of stuck with this question. So part of the reason I think it's also not dealt with very much is it's scary. It's hard to ask questions about the nature of reality, and especially things that don't line up with what we thought, right? So we have to create, like you said, a safe place where we can start to engage with these questions, face them head on, not run away from them, allow ourselves to dive deep into these big questions. And thank you for helping to keep us grounded, and I hope you'll continue to do that, because the big questions are important. And to bring it back around, it's because without that meaning, without that purpose in life, when people lose that, it's not a pretty sight. I mean, this is where like serious depression sets in, right? But you could just have a not fully formed answer to the question about the meaning of life. And I think that's what a lot of us are wrestling with, and why the self-help books are focused more on that secondary level of what kind of things are important to me, because they can go there. But that kind of general anxiety that just seems to be so pervasive right now in our world, I think is really related to this context of meaning and how do we understand it. And the traditional answers aren't matching up as well as we would like for most of us that are in more of this modern scientific age. And that's why we need to go there. But you also brought up the issue of life practices. So in thinking about Kinship Cafe, this is going to be two of the main directions that we're going to look at going forward. And I know that was kind of a big picture up front, but this is an introduction. We're not answering the questions to everything tonight. We're just setting the stage.
We're not in one session
I'm
tonight?
sorry.
We're not answering. Okay. Sorry to those of you that were expecting them tonight.
Yes. So what we are planning is essentially two different kinds of tracks that we're going to go down on alternating weeks. One track is going to be what we're calling Exploring Reality. And this is where we want to try and understand as best we can what is the nature of the universe that we live in. Because we've got to start with that if we're going to try and get to any kind of understanding of what possible meaning there might be. And the other part of it is then how do we put what we're learning into practice? We don't want this to be just simply an intellectual head game. We want to really focus on life practices, and we will definitely be focusing on those. Right now, tonight, the question that I would like to talk about is how do we sort through the varieties of answers to the question out there in terms of what is life about, what is the meaning of life? Because as soon as we try to start to think about that, we realize there is a lot of competing, answers to the conceptions of reality, and it really brings up the question, how can we know anything? I know this is, again, Mark, I'm sorry, one of those deep, high-level questions, but it's kind of where we need to start, because we have to answer this question. If we've got answer A, answer B, answer C that are all claiming to be true, how do we begin to even make our way through this, right? So, first thing, there's a couple of things we need to be aware of. We want to start with what our limits of perception are. And by that, I mean, if we were to go outside, it would appear to us that the earth is very still. It's not moving. And that if we look at the sun and the moon, they are clearly rising and setting around us. But we know that's not the case. We know that the earth is flying through space at, 66,000 miles per hour, and it's rotating around every 24 hours, and the whole thing around the sun, but all the planets and the sun themselves are all moving through space too, right? I mean, there's this great break in our perception of what things look like to us and what things actually are.
Jim, I wanted to just add here, one of the stories this reminds me of is when I had the opportunity to live in Oklahoma, of all places, back when I was doing my residency. I got to know some of the Native Americans in that area. And one of the stories, I remember one of the grandmothers sharing one night as we watched the moon at about half phase move across the night sky, was that the original understanding of what the moon was is that it was a basket. And if you think of that, it makes perfect sense. The limits of perception at that time. What was one of their primary technologies at that time? Nearly the equivalent of our computer was a basket, to be able to carry food from one place to another. And how did they understand the shape and the different slices of the moon as it would go through its phases? Well, it was a basket, assuming different positions as it would move through the sky. And if you think of it, the whole moon is accounted for by that whole basket, half moon, etc. So you're pointing out to us that at different times in history, we've been limited in our ability to understand and make sense of the world around us, let alone answer questions about well-being. We're limited by our existing knowledge and what we have been exposed to already. Is that part of what you're talking about?
There's certainly the issue of existing knowledge, which we'll get to here. But limits of perception are just, we're only fine-tuned to be able to perceive certain things. Like we know there's far more different wavelengths of light than we can perceive. The continental drift is moving at about the same speed as our fingernails grow, but that's too slow for us to notice. We can't notice the hour hand on the clock move, right? It's because we're not fine-tuned enough to notice or be able to see those things. And that's where those limits of perception come in that we need to account for, that there's more to what meets the eye or what we can touch, right? And so part of what we've got to do is figure out how do we get around those limitations. Another aspect of it that I'd like to talk about is mental mediation. So speaking of vision, when we are looking at something, it appears like right now that there's a very cohesive view here. I've got peripheral vision, I can see you guys, and things are pretty smooth when I move my head around. That's not actually what's going on. Our eyes are darting around all over the place. They can only see a pretty small area at any given time. And in the middle of that small area that they can actually see, there's actually a big hole because of how our eyes are designed. And so what happens is our brain is sampling all these images from all these places and stitching it together into a complete image that you can see where there isn't any hole in there, and it looks like it's still. It looks like my head's moving, but everything else is staying stable. If you think about how video cameras worked before they had image stabilization and somebody's walking down the road holding it, it looked like everything was moving all over the place. That's happening when you move your head or when you walk, but your brain is getting in the way. It's taking that information and translating it in such a way that it looks smooth, that it looks complete, that there isn't any holes in the middle of it. This is a key issue that's going to come into play, especially down the road when we start to look at how does our mind work, how do these processes work. One example I'd like to give you is a scientific experiment that happened a little while ago where the researchers brought people into a room with a computer screen and everything's pretty much black, and they would flash very quickly a little green dot in one corner of the screen and then a red dot in the other corner of the screen. But it would happen pretty quickly, like a just quick, pop, pop. And then they asked them, well, what did this look like? What did you see? And they said, well, it looked like there was a green light that lit up over here, and it moved across the screen and gradually turned red and then disappeared. Of course, very quickly, but they perceived it as this motion. Now, what's interesting about that is clearly there's a trick of the eyes, right? That there's this two separate things that are happening that are getting tied together, and there's this gradual transition. But what's key about it is that for the mind to construct this narrative, for our brains to perceive this light moving and gradually changing from green to red and then disappearing, you would have to know the end of that story from the beginning in order to construct it. In other words, your brain had to already know the beginning and the ending point and the ending color in order to construct the story where it gradually moves and gradually changes color. That means there is a delay between the input and our conscious awareness of that input, and our brain is doing stuff in between that impacts that. And again, even in that simple example where we know what actually happened because of how the experiment was set up, that it was two different lights, we perceived it as a light that moved and gradually changed color, right? So that's a key issue that we're going to have to focus on, is this idea of mental mediation. And then you started to bring up, Mark, questions about prior knowledge. Mm-hmm. So we can think about predispositions. That's going to come into play when we think about what do we think is actually possible in the world. When some kind of events happen, we're going to interpret them in light of what we think is possible. It's very rare that we witness something extremely different and new that we don't try to fit in with something that we already know. And that makes it very hard for us to learn new things or see outside the box, so to speak. And that goes as well with that other point here about existing knowledge is going to have a constraint on how we tie things together.
Reminds me of a really powerful piece of research done a number of years ago in an educational setting where teachers were instructed in one case to actually communicate the message to students that they were superstar performers and set an expectation of ability and capability far beyond what previously these kids were hearing about themselves. And the shift there was in a cognitive expectation that the teacher systematically introduced to the students and resulted in wildly impressive increases in performance of those kids. So this piece about cognitive bias and distortions and how our brain fills in things that aren't even perceptually there. Or later in this series, as we start talking about well-being issues related to things like how we treat each other in the world, or how should we value the environment, or what form should our government take, we're going to see that these limitations that are wired into our brains also show up in those contexts. A preview of kind of where we're headed in the what's this all about and why does it really matter department.
Yes.
I think I kind of can challenge all of this in a way, that this perception of reality and distortions and everything. We talked about this earlier, but what is this like for somebody living with a serious mental illness who has psychosis like I do? Because when I'm in psychosis, my perception is that I'm Jesus or Michael Jackson. So that adds a whole layer to what you're talking about here, is maybe your perceptions change over time, and perceptions can change for a split second for somebody like me or somebody who has anxiety. So it's kind of like, I mean, we're all going to have a different answer to this because of our perceptions in a way. And for me, my perceptions are this now, but when I'm in psychosis, I'm not on this world at all. So for me, to question reality is a constant. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of interesting to be a part of this discussion as somebody who's out of reality sometimes.
So do you find with your background that people, I don't know how to phrase it exactly, that are coming from more of a standard perspective on things?
Kind of like a typical, yeah.
More typical, that are you amazed that they don't question it more?
I mean, I guess I don't even think about that really. I didn't start questioning reality until my first manic episode. And then I really started thinking, wow, my perception is my reality. Mm. Our perceptions are our realities for every person, and we can only look from our reality. And so, I can only get my perspective of this, and how is it that we can integrate all of our questions of what reality is,
Veronica, am I remembering that one of the lyrics from your song had the phrase, terrible, beautiful mind? Mm-hmm. I remember when I heard that, how our mind is capable of imagining and being able to put together two concepts, two words that seem so opposite or as if they don't fit together. Mm-hmm. what you're pointing out in your awareness of how sometimes you can split from the consensual reality that perhaps you're not Jesus Christ after all, is your ability now to have that awareness and recognize that you can go in and out of states. And the point I think, Jim, that you were starting to bring up is all of us need to collectively, and I think this is really one of our main objectives here, is for all of us to not claim any sort of epistemological superiority. Oh my God, is that a psychologist talking or what? That my way of knowing is superior, that I know the truth. I know.
Certainty.
I mean, it's common sense. Can't you see it? And that actually is the core of where we're starting. And what the beautiful thing is that we would hope to set a safe enough setting for all of us to come to the table with our slices on reality, whether at times, admittedly, perhaps neurochemically,
It's a neurochemical thing.
Kilter, and ability to recognize that when
That's
that
where
happens.
there's a misconception, and if you don't have mental illness, you can't understand that.
Right.
There's no coming back. It's not a choice. It's not a choice. In fact, one time I was in a coffee shop, fine, and when I opened up the door, I thought I died and went to heaven. It's not a choice. And I'm glad I'm here to kind of be this voice as well, because yes, perceptions can be changed, but there are points in life where there's no turning back. There are points when your mind can take over and you don't have a choice. And I think I'm glad I'm here to kind of touch on that too. And there are points when I can, just like all of us. But I think when it comes to having a chemical imbalance, depression, OCD, whatever it is, there are points of no return that you kind of have to wait out.
And one of the things we'll be talking about, Jim, over time is the legacy of what science is showing us to understand exactly what we're talking about here, the different states that we can get into, the neurochemical imbalances, as well as the natural wiring. This is what you're talking about here, back to our point here of how we're inherently limited with how our brains are wired, even if we're not experiencing episodic psychosis.
Yeah.
Well, and it gets to the point you were saying about, having a superior point of view. We can think of it in terms of certainty, right? That part of what we need to develop is a little bit more of a humility about what we know. Because as you're bringing up, sometimes there can be powerful persuasions from
And I'm 100% sure in those moments.
Yeah.
Yeah, like you're saying,
And
superiority. Yeah.
And all of us have those feelings, right? Like, as interesting as it is to kind of observe, it's a little bit scary. There's a return to this whole flat earth movement. I don't know if you've seen the stuff on YouTube, but there's whole videos where they're like trying to explain scientifically how actually the world is flat. And they keep bringing it back to their perception. How obviously you don't, heard a guy trying to say, where are you going to film a helicopter taking off upside down? They're just not able to get beyond their particular perception.
Which is the setup for where I think we're going. How do we then accommodate for these kinds of limitations? And our understanding, part of the legacy of the Enlightenment was this notion that there is an appeal to public reason, that there must be some common sense of what reality is and be able to prove or at least justify in some way. What's our method? What's our way of being able to make our way through this world and address some of these challenges to well-being?
All right. In a phrase, consensually validatable information.
I had no idea that was coming up.
It is exactly what you're saying. How can we get beyond our own perceptions and work with other people to confirm that what we're coming up with, the types of results that we're seeing, are something that somebody else can validate, that they can come up with a similar thing? Basically, we're talking about the scientific method, which is, varied depending on what you're talking about. But it has been extremely successful at helping us to just learn at such a prodigious rate so much about our nature of our reality in such a short period of time. There's never been a methodology that's been more successful at helping us to understand. And it's based on this idea of how can we validate this against other people being able to do the same thing. We talked about religion. I don't want people to get the idea that this is like a taboo topic here or that we're being anti-religious. I think that there's a lot of people for whom religion is extremely important, and we want to acknowledge that and deal with those questions and those concerns as they come up. But we need to have it a safe place where all the different perspectives can be looked at, right? I don't want it to be something where we're not creating a safe place for people regardless of where they're coming from. But what we do want to be able to do is ask questions. And it's okay if somebody has a difference of opinion or they want to look at things differently. So I just want to make sure we set those kind of ground rules right from the beginning. And I guess I want to know, Mark, what are you hoping that we're going to get out of all this?
Well, I think more of what started off, how many years ago did we meet, Jim? Was that about 5 years ago or so?
Probably something like that.
So you and I, as I mentioned, we met in a cafe. We started having conversations about some pretty heavy subjects. Jim, if any of you know, if you've seen him out in public, he's always got this load of books with him, and he's reading about neurobiology. Right now he's reading about the physics of the origin of the universe. We're going to hear about this, and I'm going to learn a bunch of stuff in the process. We connected around these big ideas. And since you knew me as a sort of psychologist turned brain coach, that's what I do. I specialize in coaching people with ADD now. You and I found a common interest around how do we apply some of this actually revolutionary science that's coming our way now. And there's a fascinating sort of evolving and interrelationship among biological, sociological, psychological, neurological sciences right now that inform us about some additional ways and tools and practices that we can employ to address these questions, these challenges around well-being. Mm-hmm. And I'm excited about you and I having those conversations, talking about those practices, mounting some of those up on the online source that you're going to talk about here in a bit, and engaging people here in this audience and in our life practices sessions that we're going to be having to apply this in some fun and some engaging ways on into the future. That's what I'm looking forward to.
Great.
Yeah.
Like it. Veronica, this is obviously your first time. It's everybody's first time since this is our first one. What do you think about what we're up to here?
I mean, it's interesting to question, and I feel like I've done my own type of work to think about, like when you talked about the meaning of life, I think the meaning we have in life is what we put on it. We put the meaning on life. If somebody sees a butterfly and they say, oh, that's my grandmother coming to me, I always see butterflies when I see my grandmother. It's probably a butterfly. There's a good chance that it could just be a butterfly, but when you put that meaning onto it, it becomes more. And without meaning, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And so as humans, I feel like we grasp to make meaning so that our life has a purpose. And I think my life does have a purpose because I give it that purpose. So that's where I think meaning comes in my particular way and how I feel. And just like all of us, it's such a journey to kind of come to these conclusions. And in 10 years, I might feel a little different because of my life experiences. But at this point in my life, that's kind of how I feel. And it's really interesting to see other people's takes. I actually have been interviewed on this type of topic before, being somebody who isn't always here, is generally here, and it's only happened 3 times in my life where I go away for a little bit. But when I come back with a new perspective and a little bit of a new perception and maybe a little more caution too. So yeah, it's fun to talk about this kind of stuff. I always enjoy it.
Yeah.
I just want to say that I really appreciated witnessing part of the meaning of your life in your artistry tonight, in your music.
Thank you.
It is obvious. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. And that's one of the reasons why, besides the fact that I love music, I really wanted to include the artist's perspective in what we're talking about too. Because as you mentioned, I can tend to get way off on the academic side of things. And it's good to bring in some different concepts and ideas. For me, when I think about well-being, which is at the core where we want to go with this, is meaning is hugely tied with that. Like you said, the human condition kind of requires us to have some kind of meaning to ascribe to what's going on, or we just we fail in a big way. But sometimes we start to question, is my understanding of meaning sufficient, right? And I think that when I look at where we're at in our world today, that's part of what's going on, is there's a general kind of questioning, and the traditional stories that answered that question don't have the same kind of weight that they used to have, but nothing else has kind of really come to fill that void, and that's where we're really struggling. And I think that having this conversation that's beyond us, that goes to the community, and like you said, globally, is something that is happening in lots of different ways in different places, and we're having our own kind of corner of the discussion, and hopefully it'll be something where it spurs other people to think about it and get some ideas.
There is actually some wonderful work out there around what's being called polarity management, to get to the edge of what you are talking about here, about bringing people together. I would hope that we would be creating a space for not only creating safety, but we seek to decrease dogma, increase civil discourse. That's our values here of how we want to approach this. And what you're bringing up here about how can we get a diverse group of people together with different points of view, with different experiences of reality, whether it's at times chemically induced and amplified or not, but whatever. Different points of view, and find third alternatives, solutions beyond the stuck places that we are in now. There's actually some fascinating research for us to bring to the table and talk about to further this kind of civil discourse, to understand the perspectives of others and find third solutions.
Well, and I was going to say, the question about an objective meaning is a big one, right? But the reason why that comes up from time to time is when we're talking about meaning of life to the degree that it's going to impact other people, then you've got to have some reason for doing it, right? So when we start thinking about the different ways we can construct what the meaning of life is, some of those don't work out well for everybody, right? We've had ways of looking at the world in the past where there was clear delineations along racial lines that had a worldview that said meaning of life questions, this is how it was laid out, this is how it was done by divinity, therefore it's completely justifiable that we've got people who are slaves, right? So that's where the question comes in. Yes, we're all coming up with these ideas about worldviews, but they don't always necessarily stop at, I like to think of butterflies as my grandmother, right? Beautiful. When you decide that you want to take up, arms and start shooting people in a bar, that's a whole nother story, right? And it doesn't have to be that extreme, but there's just the failure sometimes to even be able to have conversations. Like you talked about civil discourse. We've become so tribal in our thinking that people aren't listening to each other. They're just digging their heels in and looking at every conversation as an attack, and they get defensive, and they don't hear. And so we're struggling all over the place. And that's kind of where I'm trying to go. Not to say that, yes, here it is, this clear objective meaning that we can just, if everybody would just see this, all of a sudden everybody get along. I don't think that there's a way that we can actually identify that, which is why we're having the conversation. But the question is, if there isn't an objective, does that just mean all of a sudden it's completely subjective and it doesn't matter, it's just whatever anybody wants to think? And I think there's actually a bit of a middle ground, and that's kind of what we're going to explore, is how we can find more of a commonality with this idea of meaning that can be helpful, but it's not easy to get at. And to start, we have to begin with some background information, really kind of look a little bit closer at what is the nature of this world that we live in. And that'll be kind of a starting point. Well, and honestly, I look at us and I think, two old white guys. But I can't do anything about that. So yeah, we do need to be cognizant of where we're at and the challenges with that, and how do we bring in that diversity and have that larger conversation. And I'm sorry, I can't not be who I am, but I'm going to do my best to acknowledge those potential limitations and how can we work around those too. Before we close, Veronica, would you like to end us with another song?
Absolutely, sounds great.
Fantastic.
There were times when nothing has swallowed me whole. There were times when my plate was too full and I dropped it. Everything shattered and scattered everywhere. There were times when I was riding high. There were times like an arrow I'd fly till I dropped like a shooting star right out of the sky. But I remembered there is hope in the emptiest hole. There is hope. There's nowhere to go. There's hope. There is hope when you've lost everything. There is hope. Demons cling. There is hope. Oh, oh, oh. There are times when I'm paralyzed by fear. There are times when I feel a break is near. Yet I stand like a skyscraper stands tall beneath the sky. There are times when my mind races like a hungry pack of wolves. There are times it sees red and charges like a bull, yet I'm still trying to breathe as I'm right inside the eye of the storm. But somehow I remember there is hope in the emptiest hole. There is hope, and there's nowhere to go. There is hope. There is hope when you've lost everything. There is hope. The demons cling. There is hope. There is hope in the emptiest hole. There is hope when there's nowhere to go. There is hope. There is hope.
Thank you again,
Aw,
Veronica.
thank
That
you.
was awesome. And thank you, everybody, for being here. Mark, really looking forward to where this goes in the future. If you're going to join us next week, we have Daring Greatly as our musical guest in-house, and so that'll be a lot of fun. And, yeah, we're really looking forward to where this goes. Thank you again.
Oh, thank you for having me.